The morning Hester Beckett cut her hair, she did not cry, though the dark waves pooling on the dirt floor of the barn looked disturbingly like something that had died. She had spent 26 years growing it, and she cut it in less than 3 minutes with the same shearing scissors her father had used on the sheep before the drought took them. She told herself it was just hair. She told herself a lot of things that week that she did not entirely believe. It was the spring of 1882, and the Beckett land in the hill country of West Texas was the last thing standing between Hester and ruin. Her father, Ellis Beckett, had been dead for 6 weeks. Her mother had been gone for 8 years before that, taken by fever in the summer when Hester was 17. What remained was 412 acres of limestone and cedar, a modest ranch house that needed a new roof, a bunkhouse that leaked, 12 cattle, 2 horses, and a debt to the First Territorial Bank of Marfa that was due in full by the 1st of October. The debt was not enormous by some standards, but it was enormous by Hester's standards, and the only way she could see to satisfy it was to turn the ranch profitable again inside 5 months. To do that, she needed to hire hands and get the herd moving. She had placed an advertisement in 2 papers, the Marfa Messenger and the Alpine Courier, for a foreman and 3 working ranch hands, to be housed and fed at the Beckett Ranch on the southern slope of the Davis Mountains. The responses had been modest. The land was known to be difficult, the water unpredictable in dry years, and the previous foreman, a man named Grubb who had worked for her father, had left the week Ellis Beckett was buried, taking 2 of the hands with him. He had cited uncertainty about the future of the operation, which was a polite way of saying he did not believe a woman alone could keep the place running. Hester had read his departure note twice, folded it carefully, and burned it in the kitchen stove. What came next was the idea, and she was not entirely sure where it had come from. She had been standing in the barn, looking at the bunkhouse through the gap in the wall boards, watching the lantern light she'd left burning inside sway in the night breeze. She had been thinking about Calhoun Driscoll. Calhoun Driscoll was the problem, the shape of it that kept her awake. He owned the Driscoll Cattle Company, which operated on land adjacent to the Beckett Ranch on 3 sides. He had come to pay his respects at her father's funeral, dressed entirely too well for a graveside in the hill country, and he had held her hand a beat too long when he said how sorry he was. He had also, in the same breath, mentioned that he had been discussing with the bank the possibility of acquiring the eastern pasture acreage, should circumstances require it. Circumstances. She had wanted to say something sharp and direct, but there were neighbors present, and her father was barely in the ground, so she had thanked him for coming and walked back to the house. Driscoll had sent 2 more letters since then, each politely worded, and each making perfectly clear that he expected her to fail. He had also, she later discovered, spoken to the men who had been considering answering her advertisement. Not threatening them exactly, but suggesting that the Beckett Ranch was an uncertain prospect, that a young woman alone could not manage the accounts or the decisions, and that a man looking for steady work would do better elsewhere. So when the responses to her advertisement came back thin, and when the one man who did show up to interview lasted exactly 1 morning before muttering something about not taking orders from a female and riding off before noon, Hester had gone back to the barn and stared at the shearing scissors on their hook. She could not be Hester Beckett, the owner, the woman, the uncertain prospect. Not right now, not with October coming, but she could work her own land. She knew every fence line, every water source, every temperamental section of the north pasture where the ground went soft after rain. She knew cattle. She had worked beside her father since she was old enough to hold a rope. What she needed was for the foreman she had managed to hire, sight unseen, based on a letter of reference and a terse but competent response to her written questions, not to know that Hester Beckett was also the young man named Hank Beckett who would be showing up to work alongside him. The foreman's name was Warren Abbott, and he was arriving on the Thursday stage from El Paso. She had hired him based on the letter alone, which had been exactly the kind of letter she needed. No wasted words, specific experience listed plainly, references from 2 ranches she could write to verify, and a rate that was fair but not inflated. He had asked sensible questions in his reply. He had not asked anything about the owner except to confirm the terms and the date of his arrival. He did not know that the Hester Beckett who had signed the employment correspondence was the same person who had written separately, in her father's name, about a ranch hand named Hank who would also be arriving. It was an imperfect plan. She knew that. But it was the plan she had, and so on the Wednesday night before Warren Abbott arrived, she cut her hair, dug out a pair of her father's worn denim trousers from the cedar chest, and bound her chest tightly with strips of linen until she looked, in the dim reflection of the washstand mirror, like a slight young man of perhaps 20 who had not yet filled out properly. She darkened the fine skin above her upper lip with a bit of ash. It would not hold up to close inspection in bright light, but she did not intend to invite close inspection. She practiced her walk in the barn that night, conscious of her hips, keeping her shoulders squared, her steps heavier than she naturally tended. She lowered the pitch of her voice and spoke to the horses. They looked back at her with complete indifference, which she took as a good sign. By morning she had made herself into Hank Beckett, ranch hand, and she had ridden into Marfa on the older horse to wait for the Thursday stage. Warren Abbott stepped down from the stage at 2:30 in the afternoon, and Hester, standing in the shadow of the livery with her hat pulled low, assessed him in the way she had learned to assess new cattle in an unfamiliar herd, quickly, thoroughly, and without letting her conclusions show on her face. He was taller than she had expected, broad through the shoulders in a way that was functional rather than decorative, built like a man who had spent years doing the actual labor that some foreman merely supervised. He was probably 30 or thereabouts, with a face that had been weathered by sun and wind into something serious and direct. He wore a plain canvas duster and carried a single bag. His eyes, when he looked across the street and found her looking at him, were the particular shade of brown that reminded her of creek water in autumn, clear and deep and moving. She walked over, kept her eyes steady, and offered her hand. "Hank Beckett," she said, at the lower register she had been practicing. "I work the Beckett Ranch. The owner sent me to meet you." Warren Abbott looked at her hand and then at her face, and something in his gaze paused for just a fraction of a second before he took her hand and shook it with a grip that was firm but careful. "Warren Abbott, pleased to meet you. The owner will be out to the ranch later in the week," Hester said, which was true in the sense that she had already written to herself. "She asked me to get you settled and show you the operation first." "She," Warren Abbott said, not as a question exactly, but as an acknowledgement. "Yes," Hester said, meeting his eyes directly. "Miss Beckett, you have a problem with that." He looked at her again, that same steady gaze that did not flicker or shift. "No," he said simply, "I don't." They rode back to the ranch mostly in silence, and Hester spent the better part of the ride being grateful for it and slightly unnerved by the quality of Warren Abbott's quiet. He was not the kind of man who filled silence with noise, and she was not accustomed to a silence that felt so fully occupied. He looked at the land as they rode. She watched him do it and understood what he was seeing. He was reading it the way she read it. The condition of the fences, the state of the grass, the way the cattle that were visible in the south pasture were holding their weight. He did not comment, but she could see that he was cataloging everything. When they reached the ranch house, he stood in the yard for a moment and looked at the full sweep of the property, the bunkhouse, the barn, the smaller outbuildings, the house itself with its slightly sagging porch railing, and the window on the east side that had a crack in the glass her father had never gotten around to repairing. "How long has the main operation been running short-handed?" he asked. 6 weeks, Hester said. "Since the previous foreman left," he nodded slowly, "and the other hands mentioned in the advertisement. 2 are arriving Saturday," she said. She had placed a second, smaller advertisement for 2 additional hands and had managed to secure 2 responses, men who had not apparently heard Driscoll's discouraging word or had not cared. Brothers from Presidio County, good references. Warren looked at the south pasture again. We'll need to move the cattle to the north water by Monday. The South Creek looks low. It is, she said, and the agreement came out before she thought about checking it, with the ease of someone who knew the land rather than the tentativeness of someone who had just arrived. She caught herself and added carefully, I've been managing since the foreman left. He looked at her, not strangely, not suspiciously, but with an attentiveness that made her very conscious of her ash-smudged upper lip and the binding beneath her father's flannel shirt. You know this land well, he said. Grew up on it, she said, which was entirely true. He nodded once and picked up his bag. Show me the bunkhouse. The first day passed in a blur of practical necessity, and Hester was grateful for the fullness of it. She showed him the barn, the tack room, the state of the fencing on the east quarter, the location of the tools, the feed storage, and the condition of the 2 horses. She showed him the accounts book, which she had brought out in what she framed as instructions from the absent Miss Beckett, and watched him read through it with the focused attention of a man who could read figures and understand what they meant. He did not say anything pitying or dismissive about what the accounts revealed. He said, with the same level practicality he applied to everything, she's got about 4 months to make this serviceable. If we move fast on the northern fencing and get the herd into better grazing by the end of April, we'll be in a position to drive by August. The profit margin on an August drive gets the bank paid and leaves something left over. That's what I figured, Hester said. He looked up from the book. You figured that too. I've been here a while, she said carefully. The second day, the Garza brothers arrived from Presidio County, Pedro and Miguel, both of them compact and capable, and blessedly incurious about the particulars of the ranch hierarchy. They shook hands with Warren, nodded at Hester without much comment, and went straight to work with the naturalness of men who were comfortable in their labor. Hester liked them immediately, and felt a small loosening of the tension she had been carrying in her jaw since the plan began. She worked hard that second day, harder than she had worked even in the difficult weeks since her father's death, because she was no longer working alone, and the energy of other people working beside her was like water to something that had been quietly thirsting. She mended fence with Pedro, who spoke to her in a pleasant mix of Spanish and English, and did not seem to notice or care about her gender. She hauled water with Miguel, who sang quietly to himself, and moved with an efficiency that made even hard labor look comfortable. And she worked beside Warren Abbott, who was everything his letter had suggested and more, directing without condescending, working with his hands alongside the men rather than standing apart and pointing, and carrying a quiet authority that the Garza brothers responded to naturally. By midday she had watched 3 exchanges between him and the brothers, and found herself thinking that this was the kind of man her father would have trusted, and the thought sat warmly in her chest in a way she did not examine too closely. It was on the 3rd day that it happened. They had been at the north fence since early morning, all 4 of them, restringing wire along a section that had sagged badly enough to be a genuine liability. The day was warmer than the ones before it, the Texas sun coming in with the full force of late March, and by mid-morning Hester had shed her father's flannel overshirt and was working in the lighter cotton beneath, which was not, she realized somewhat late, as concealing as she would have preferred. She had been working close beside Warren, the 2 of them handling a particularly stubborn post that needed to be reset and retamped, when she slipped in the soft earth at the base of the hole. She caught herself on the post, which meant Warren caught her, his hand coming out reflexively to stabilize her arm, and for the space of 2 or 3 seconds they were very close, and his hand was on her arm just below the shoulder, and his gaze dropped to that point of contact and then came back up to her face. His expression did not change. Not exactly, but something in it shifted, the way the surface of water shifts when something passes beneath it, invisible and definite at once. He let go of her arm, steadied the post with both hands, and said, "Watch the soft ground there," with the same level, practical tone he used for everything. "Thank you," she said, and her voice, she was nearly certain, had slipped briefly out of its lower register. He did not comment on that either. By the end of that day, she was as certain as she could be without his having said anything that he knew. She lay in the bunkhouse that night, in the bunk she had assigned herself at the far end, listening to Miguel Garza's even breathing and the distant sound of Warren Abbott moving quietly in the bunkhouse's partitioned foreman's corner, and she went through every interaction of the day and arrived at the same conclusion each time. He knew, and he had not said a word. She spent a considerable portion of that night deciding what to do about this, and by morning she had decided to do nothing except continue exactly as she was. If he chose to say something, she would deal with it then. If he chose not to, she would accept that gift without interrogating it. What she had not anticipated was how different it would feel to work beside a man who knew her secret, even one who kept it perfectly, compared to the day before when she had merely been afraid he might discover it. It changed the quality of every interaction, made each glance and each quiet exchange feel weighted with something she could not name and was not ready to name. On the fourth morning, he brought her coffee before she was up, setting it on the railing outside the bunkhouse at the spot he had apparently noticed. She always stood in for the first 5 minutes of the day, looking out at the east pasture while the light came in. She came out to find it there, still steaming, and looked across the yard to where he was already standing at the barn door. He did not look at her. She picked up the cup and drank it and felt something warm move through her that was not entirely attributable to the coffee. In the second week, Calhoun Driscoll came. He rode in on a Monday afternoon on a handsome gray that probably cost more than Hester's most optimistic monthly cattle projection. And he came with a man she did not recognize, heavyset, and wearing a town suit that had no business being on horseback in the Davis Mountains. He dismounted in the yard with the proprietary ease of a man who considers a visit to be a kind of inspection, and he looked at the activity going on around him. The mended fence posts Pedro was painting with tar to discourage rot, the cattle visible and well placed in the north pasture, the barn door standing open over a floor that had been freshly swept, and something in his expression tightened with what she recognized as displeasure. "This is Harland Ives," Driscoll said to the yard in general. "He's the new regional man from the 1st Territorial." Warren had come out of the barn by then, and he stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt in the unconscious way he had when he was observing something he was not yet ready to speak about. Hester positioned herself near the water trough, hat pulled down, watching. "The owner here?" Driscoll asked Warren. "She'll be along shortly," Warren said, which was not strictly a lie. "I'm the foreman, Warren Abbott. Can I help you?" Driscoll's eyes moved over the property with the assessing look of someone doing an unwilling calculation. "Place looks different than it did a month ago." "We've been working," Warren said simply. Driscoll looked at the man from the bank. The man from the bank looked at his papers. "We were under the impression," Driscoll said, "that the operation was under considerable strain." "Under impression from where?" Warren asked, with the kind of politeness that has something harder beneath it. Driscoll did not answer that directly. "We simply wanted to assess the situation, make sure Miss Beckett is aware of all her options." "I believe she's aware of her options," Warren said. "And from what I can see, the operation is on track to satisfy the debt by October. You're welcome to write to her directly if you have concerns about the accounts." Harland Ives cleared his throat. "Perhaps a look at the books." "The books are private property," Warren said, still pleasant, still immovable. "You're welcome to an appointment with Miss Beckett. I'd suggest writing ahead." There was a long pause. Driscoll looked across the yard, and his eyes passed over Hester in her hat and her father's work clothes without pausing, and she felt the odd relief of invisibility. He looked back at Warren with the expression of a man who has encountered an obstacle he did not expect and is recalculating his approach. "Tell her we came by," he said finally. "I will," Warren said. They rode out. Hester did not move until the sound of the hooves faded, and then she walked toward the barn and found that her hands were shaking slightly, not with fear exactly, but with the aftermath of standing very still while something important happened around her. Warren appeared in the barn doorway. "You all right?" he asked, with the careful neutrality of someone who was asking something specific under the cover of something general. "I'm fine," she said. "Thank you for what you said." "I meant all of it," he said. "The operation is on track." She looked up at him. In the shadow of the barn, with the late afternoon light coming in at a low angle across the yard behind him, he looked exactly like the kind of man she had always half believed she would never find. Solid and quiet and principled in a way that was not performed but simply present, the way gravity was present. "Warren," she said, and it was the first time she had used his name without the formal address, and she felt it in her throat. "Hank," he said, and the way he said it, with the smallest possible emphasis on the word, told her everything. She held his gaze for a moment that stretched like the light at the end of a long day, and then she said, "I need to go check the east fence line," and walked out of the barn before she did something she was not ready to do. She went to the east fence line and stood there for a while in the cooling air, listening to the cedar wrens and the distant complaint of cattle and the wind moving through the scrub oak. And she thought about what it meant that Warren Abbott knew who she was and had chosen, every single day, to keep her secret. She thought about this for 3 days, during which she worked beside him and ate at the same table in the bunkhouse, and felt the specific quality of his attention, which was the attention of someone who was looking at the whole of her, and finding that whole worth looking at. And she thought about it until the thinking became unnecessary, which was how she knew. On the 17th day of his employment at the Beckett Ranch, Hester woke before dawn and did not get up immediately. She lay in the narrow bunk and listened to the world outside assembling itself out of darkness, and she made a decision. She got up, braided what remained of her short hair back with a piece of twine, put on her own clothes for the first time since the cutting, the dark skirt and the better blouse she had folded into the bottom of her saddlebag when she left the house, and went to the barn. Warren was already there, as she had known he would be. He rose before anyone always, and the first sound of the day on the Beckett Ranch was reliably the sound of him moving in the barn in the gray hour before the others woke. He turned when he heard her come in, and the lantern light caught his face, and she watched him take in what she was wearing, which was not, for the first time since he had arrived, her father's work clothes and a hat pulled down against the world. He looked at her for a long moment. His expression did not collapse into surprise. It settled instead into something that had been waiting for room. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. "I think it's time we talked honestly." "I've been honest," he said. "You've been quiet," she said, "which I appreciate more than I can say, but I want to be honest now." She took a breath. "My name is Hester Beckett. I own this ranch. I've owned it since my father died 6 weeks before you arrived, and I could not keep it as a woman alone because Calhoun Driscoll made sure no one would work for me or take me seriously, so I made myself into someone they might." He was quiet for a moment. "Hank Beckett," he said softly. "My own name," she said, "more or less." "I know," he said, "by the 3rd day." "How?" she asked with genuine curiosity. He considered this seriously, as he considered everything. "The way you moved around this land," he said, "like it was yours, which it is, and the way you talked about the South Creek, not like you'd looked it up but like you'd watched it every year of your life." He paused. "And your hands." She looked at her hands. They were work-roughened and capable, but they were her hands. "What about them?" she asked. "They're careful hands," he said. "Careful in the way of someone who loves what they're working with, not just someone who's doing a job." He met her eyes. "I've worked for a lot of people, Miss Beckett. I know the difference." She was quiet for a moment. "You could have said something. You could have left." "I could have," he agreed. "Why didn't you?" He held her gaze with that steady Creekwater look, and for a moment the barn was very still around them, the horses breathing softly in their stalls, the lantern swaying just slightly in the draft from the open door. "Because you needed what you were doing to work," he said, "and because watching you do it was one of the most remarkable things I've seen." She felt something warm and large move through her chest, and she did not look away from him. "That's a very kind thing to say. It's a true thing," he said. "I don't generally say things just to be kind." "No," she said. "I've noticed that." The silence between them was different from the silences they had shared before. It was not the silence of two people who did not know each other. It was the silence of two people who knew each other better than the length of their acquaintance could easily explain, and both of them were feeling the weight of that and finding it, somewhat unexpectedly, not heavy at all. "I need to tell the Garza brothers," she said. "I don't want to deceive them." "They'll be fine," he said. "Pedro figured it out on day 5. She stared at him. "He did." "He hasn't said anything either," Warren said, and there was the smallest suggestion of warmth in his voice that she was coming to understand, was his version of a smile. She laughed then, a real laugh, the first one she had managed in 6 weeks, and it came out of her before she could moderate it, and she put her hand over her mouth because the sound of it surprised her. When she looked back at Warren, he was watching her with an expression that was so open and unguarded that it stopped the breath in her throat. "Hester," he said, just her name. But the way he said it was the way you say something you have been turning over in your mouth for a while, quietly in the private hours. "Warren," she said back in the same tone. He crossed the barn in 3 steps, and she did not move back. And when he was standing very close to her, he stopped and looked at her with a question in his eyes that was asking something without words. She answered it without words either, and he put his hand gently along the line of her jaw and bent his head and kissed her, quietly and with great care, in the lantern light of her father's barn on a March morning in 1882. It was not a fierce kiss. It was the kind of kiss that is the beginning of something long, unhurried, and certain. The kind that two people arrive at when they have been circling each other with great care for 3 weeks and have finally, together, decided to stop. She stepped back after a moment and looked at him, and he looked back at her, and neither of them said anything immediately, which was exactly right. "I need you to keep working for me," she said finally, "as my foreman, properly." "I intend to," he said. "And whatever this is," she said, because she was a practical woman and she was going to say the thing, "I want to do it honestly, not in secret." "So do I," he said. "I've never done much of anything in secret." "Neither have I," she said, with a slight edge of irony, gesturing at her bound chest and cut hair. He did look like he was almost smiling then, definitely. "Fair point," he said. She went to find Pedro Garza after breakfast, while Miguel was occupied with the horses and Warren was at the far fence line. She sat with Pedro on the water trough with 2 cups of coffee and told him the truth plainly, and Pedro listened with the attentive patience of someone who already knows the ending of the story being told to him. When she finished, he nodded once and said, "I am glad the ranch is in good hands, Miss Beckett." And that was essentially all he said about it. Miguel was more expressive. He looked between Hester and Pedro when they told him together, blinked twice, then broke into a wide grin and said, "I thought there was something," and then went back to the horses with the satisfaction of a man whose instincts had been confirmed. Hester rode back to the ranch house that evening for the first time since she had moved into the bunkhouse, and she stood in the kitchen her father had built and felt the enormous weight of the past weeks settle differently on her shoulders, not gone, not light, but differently arranged. She lit the lamp on the kitchen table and began to compose a letter, and she wrote it slowly and with care, because it mattered that every word was right. It was addressed to Harland Ives at the First Territorial Bank of Marfa, and it was written in her own name, clearly, signed as Hester Beckett, owner of the Beckett Ranch, providing a formal accounting of the operation's current status and projected income for the August cattle drive, along with a request for a meeting the following week to discuss the payment schedule in detail. She wrote a second letter to Calhoun Driscoll, which was shorter and more direct, informing him that the Beckett Ranch was not available for acquisition, that all communications regarding the property should be addressed to herself rather than to intermediaries, and that she trusted there would be no further necessity for the bank's regional man to make unscheduled visits. She sealed both letters and set them on the table to be sent in the morning, and she felt very much like herself for the first time in weeks. Warren came to the house the following morning with the account book and a list of things he had worked out about the April plan, and they sat at the kitchen table together and went through it with the comfortable directness of two people who have no interest in performing anything for each other. He had a pencil behind his ear and occasionally used it to make a small notation in the margin of his work, and she noticed his handwriting, which was plain and precise and looked like exactly what she would have expected. "You write like someone who was properly schooled," she said. "My mother believed in it," he said. "Ran the schoolhouse in the town where I grew up in the hill country east of here. Different hills." He glanced up. "My father," she said, "and my mother before she died, they thought reading and figuring were as necessary as riding and roping." "They were right," he said. "They usually were," she said, with a fondness that had grief in it and lived beside the grief without being consumed by it. He was quiet for a moment. "Your father built this place himself, with one other man," she said, "a friend. He came to Texas from Tennessee in 1855, when the land was going cheap, and the price of cheap land was that you had to be hard enough to hold it." She paused. "He was. He held it for 27 years. And now you're holding it," Warren said. "I intend to," she said, "for the rest of my life." He looked at her across the table, and there was something in his expression that was asking that question again, the wordless one, the one about the rest of her life and what it might contain. "Warren," she said. "Yes." "Tell me about yourself," she said. "Tell me something real. We've been working beside each other for 3 weeks, and I know how you set a fence post, and I know how you handle a nervous horse, but I don't know where you came from or what you want." He set the pencil down and leaned back in the chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, which she was learning was a thing he did when he was organizing his thoughts rather than performing thinking for someone else's benefit. "I grew up in Llano County," he said. "My father had a small cattle operation. Not successful, exactly, but honest. He died when I was 22 of a fever that took him in less than a week, the same kind of thing that takes people out here without warning, and after that I worked ranches because it was what I knew and it suited me. I've been a hand and I've been a foreman and I've never wanted to be anything else particularly." He paused. "I've never stayed anywhere very long." "Why not?" she asked. "Never felt like I was supposed to," he said simply. "Never felt like I found the place that was mine to stay in." She held his gaze across the table. "Is that what you're looking for, a place that's yours?" "I'm beginning to think," he said, with that careful deliberateness that she now recognized as his form of great emotional honesty, "that it's not just a place." She felt the heat in her face and did not look away from it. "That's a significant thing to say to someone you've known 3 weeks. "I know it," he said. "I'm not a man who says things lightly." "I know that too," she said. "That's part of the problem." "Is it a problem?" he asked. "No," she said after a moment. "I don't think it is." The meeting with Harland Ives at the bank went better than she had dared to hope. She drove into Marfa on the appointed day in her own clothes, her hair grown back enough to be pinned properly, even if it was shorter than fashion considered ideal, and she sat across from Ives with the account book and the projected figures Warren had helped her organize, and she laid out the case for the ranch's viability with the calm, thorough precision of someone who had been running figures in her head since childhood. Ives was a cautious man by nature, not unkind but shaped by the institution he served, and he spent the better part of an hour asking questions, each of which she answered with the specificity that comes from actual knowledge rather than optimistic invention. When it was over, he agreed to a payment schedule that gave her until the 1st of November rather than October, contingent on a partial payment from the August drive proceeds, and he shook her hand and said, with what appeared to be genuine respect, that the bank was glad to see the operation moving forward. She drove home in the late afternoon light with the agreement signed and folded in her coat pocket, and the Davis Mountains turning gold and purple in front of her. And she thought about her father, who had never gotten the chance to see what she could do on her own. And she thought about her mother, who had always known and said so when Hester was young enough to need to hear it. and she felt both of them in the air around her in the way you feel people who are gone when you are doing something they would have been proud of. Warren was at the gate when she drove in, which she did not think was a coincidence, and he opened it and looked at her face with his reading water gaze and said, "It went well." "It did," she said. He took the reins of the horse while she climbed down, and she told him the terms as they walked the horse to the barn, and he listened and nodded and said it was a good outcome and that the August drive projection was realistic given their current trajectory. "We'll make it," he said. "I know," she said. And then, because she had been thinking about things in the cart on the way home and had reached the point where thinking became unnecessary, she said, "I want to ask you something." He looked at her. "When October comes," she said, "and the debt is paid and the ranch is secured, I want you to stay." "I'm not planning to leave," he said. "Not as my foreman," she said carefully, "or not only as my foreman." He was very still for a moment, and the evening air was soft around them, and the horse nudged him gently with its nose because it wanted to be in the barn, and neither of them moved. "Hester," he said. "I know it's fast," she said. "I know it hasn't been long. But you're the most honest person I've met in years, and you kept my secret when you didn't have to, and you looked at me like I was worth looking at even when I was pretending to be someone else, and I have been thinking about that every day for 3 weeks, and I think—" She stopped. "I think I would very much like for you to stay." He reached out and took her hand, which was the kind of gesture that is simple in the doing and enormous in the meaning, and he held it with that same careful firmness she had noticed from the first handshake in Marfa, like something he intended to hold well. "I'm already staying," he said. "I decided that about a week in." "You decided that before I asked you," she said. "Yes," he said. "I wanted to make sure it was what you wanted too." "Warren Abbott," she said. "Hester Beckett," he said back. She leaned up and kissed him in the last of the evening light, and he put his other arm around her and kissed her back with a warmth that did not feel like a beginning at all, but like the continuation of something that had been underway for a while quietly, beneath everything else. April moved into May with the particular energy of a ranch finding its rhythm, and the Beckett operation was not merely surviving, but beginning to genuinely function. The Garza brothers had settled into the work with the ease of men who are where they want to be, and they had each, in their different ways, become part of the fabric of the place. Pedro maintained a quiet and devoted relationship with every horse on the property, and had begun making small improvements to the barn's organization that Hester found sensible and touching. Miguel had proved to be a gifted rough carpenter, and had fixed the porch railing, the east window, and the worst section of bunkhouse roof without being asked. Warren ran the daily operation with a practical intelligence that left Hester consistently impressed, not because she had low expectations of him, but because the quality of his judgment continued to reveal itself in new ways. He had a gift for anticipating problems a day or two before they became actual, and a manner with the cattle that spoke to the kind of patience that cannot be taught by instruction, but only by long attention. And between Hester and Warren, something was growing that had the quality of deep water, not showy, not easily disturbed, but substantial and moving always in one direction. They talked in the evenings when the work was done, on the porch of the ranch house where she had moved back properly after the disclosure to the Garza brothers. They talked about the land and the work and the books they had each read and the things they believed about the world and the things they were uncertain of. He was a good listener, which she valued more than almost any other quality, and she was a clear thinker, which he said early and genuinely seemed to mean. One evening in late April, he told her about a ranch in New Mexico where he had worked for 2 years before coming to Texas. A large operation owned by a man who treated his Mexican workers as though they were less than human, docked their pay for invented infractions, housed them in conditions he would not have put livestock in, and refused to allow them on the same ground as white cowhands except for the purposes of shared labor. Warren had lasted 2 years because he had intervened between the owner and the workers more times than he could count, and had finally been told to leave when he refused to stand by during what he described with compressed precision, as a beating that had no justification. "I should have left sooner," he said. "I stayed because I thought I was doing some good, but I was also making it possible for the place to run, which meant I was part of what was wrong with it." "You left when it mattered most," she said. "I should have left when it mattered first," he said. She thought about this. "I think most people do the right thing a little later than they wish they had," she said. "The ones who do it at all." He looked at her. "You did it exactly when it needed doing," he said. "You cut your hair and you saved your land." "I had help," she said. "I had you." "You had yourself," he said. "I was just a person who didn't get in your way," she laughed softly. "You're considerably more than that." "I'm working on it," he said, and that was the closest thing to a joke she had heard from him in 5 weeks of knowing him, and it was worth waiting for. Calhoun Driscoll made one more attempt in May. He did not come in person this time. He sent a lawyer from Marfa with a document that purported to show that there was a dispute over the northeastern boundary of the Beckett property. A document suggesting that 30 acres of the North Pasture's most reliable grazing land actually fell within the original Driscoll land grant, and had only been used by the Becketts by informal tolerance. Hester read the document at the kitchen table with Warren beside her and felt the specific cold fury of someone being manipulated through a system that is supposed to protect them. "Is there any truth to it?" Warren asked. "None," she said. "My father's deed is clear. The northeastern boundary is the ridge line. It's been the ridge line since 1857. She stood up. "I need to find the original survey." She found it in the cedar chest, wrapped in oilcloth against the damp, alongside her father's deed and the original filing papers from the Territorial Land Office. The survey was precise and dated 1857, and signed by a surveyor whose credentials were listed in the document with the thoroughness of someone who expected to be challenged. She took everything to Marfa the following morning, not to the bank, but to the office of a lawyer named Dorothea Finch, who was one of a very small number of women practicing law in Texas in 1882, and who had a reputation for being exactly as sharp as she needed to be. Hester had heard of her from her father, who had said once that Finch was the person you went to when someone was trying to take something from you that was legally yours. Dorothea Finch was a woman of perhaps 50 with gray in her dark hair and spectacles she wore on a chain, and she read the Driscoll document and the original survey, and the deed with the focused attention of someone who reads the fine print of everything out of habit. When she finished, she set her spectacles on her desk and said, "This is frivolous, Miss Beckett, but frivolous things can be expensive to fight if they get to the courthouse. Let me write a letter." The letter she wrote was 2 pages, cited 4 specific provisions of Texas land law, quoted the 1857 survey chapter and verse, and concluded with a polite but unmistakable suggestion that any attempt to pursue this claim in court would result in a countersuit that would prove, in a very public forum, the nature and timing of the original challenge. She sent it by courier to Driscoll's lawyer and a copy to the land office in Marfa, and within 2 weeks the matter was dropped with no further communication. Hester paid Dorothea Finch's fee and shook her hand, and rode home feeling lighter than she had in months. She told Warren about it that evening, and he listened through to the end and then said, "She sounds like someone your father would have liked." "She sounds like someone my mother would have been friends with," Hester said. He smiled at that, a real one, and she had learned by then that his real smiles were rare and therefore worth considerably more than the common variety. June arrived with heat and hard work and the beginning of preparations for the August drive, and the ranch was moving with a rhythm that felt, for the first time since Ellis Beckett's death, like the rhythm of something that was going to continue. Warren proposed to her on a Tuesday evening in the middle of June, which was a practical day for it, which was exactly like him, and she was grateful because she would not have wanted anything theatrical. He came to the porch where she was sitting with the account book, and he sat beside her and looked out at the pasture for a moment, and then he turned and said, "Hester, I want to marry you." Not will you marry me in the asking form, but I want to marry you in the declarative, with the particular warmth of someone stating a truth rather than making a request. She had thought about this enough that the answer was immediately available. I want that too, she said. He looked at her for a moment with that full, clear expression that she had come to think of as the realest face she had ever seen on another person. When the drive is done and the debt is paid, he said, I want to do it properly, with time to do it right. Not before, she asked. If you want before, I'll do before, he said. I just want to give you the drive first. It's yours. The paying off should be yours. I don't want to fold myself into it until you've done what you set out to do. She looked at him for a long moment. That is possibly the most thoughtful thing anyone has ever said to me, she said. I mean it practically, he said, with the slight defensiveness of a man who is not used to being credited with sentiment. I know you do, she said. That's why it's so thoughtful. They sat on the porch together until the dark came in from the mountains, and the night was warm and full of cricket sound, and she leaned her head against his shoulder because it was exactly the right height, and his arm came around her and settled there with the ease of something that had always been intended. July was the hardest month. The heat built to the kind of intensity that makes the air itself seem thick and reluctant, and they pushed the cattle and themselves through it with the determined energy of people who have an October deadline and a future on the other side of it. There were days when the work was so demanding, and the heat so oppressive that she and Warren barely spoke, functioning in the comfortable near silence of two people who have learned each other's rhythms well enough that words are often unnecessary. He knew when she needed water before she asked and brought it. She knew when he needed to be left alone to think a problem through without discussion, and gave him the space without comment. Pedro and Miguel had been told about the engagement by then, which Pedro accepted with the same dignified nod he gave to most things, and which Miguel celebrated by producing from somewhere in the bunkhouse, a bottle of good tequila that they shared one evening on the barn steps, the four of them together in the warm dark, and it was one of those evenings that Hester knew she would remember precisely for the rest of her life. The smell of the summer night, and the sound of Miguel laughing at something Pedro said in rapid Spanish and Warren's hand warm over hers. The August drive went south and east toward Pecos in the company of two other small operations they joined at a prearranged point, the kind of cooperative arrangement that small ranchers made when a larger combined herd could command better prices at market than a handful of cattle showing up alone. Hester drove the chuck wagon, which was the most practical decision given that she knew the route and could navigate and cook simultaneously, and she handled both functions with the efficiency of someone who does not see any virtue in false modesty about her own competence. Warren managed the drive with the same quiet authority he managed everything, and by the time they reached Pecos and the cattle buyers came out to assess the herd, the animals were in good condition, and the price offered was within the range Warren had projected, and the transaction was completed on the second morning with a payment that covered the bank debt with enough left over to carry the ranch through the winter and into the next year's operation. Hester sat in the office of the Pecos livestock agent with the receipt in her hand and looked at the figure on the paper and felt something release in her chest that she had been holding since the day she cut her hair, something she had not even entirely been aware of as a tension until it was gone, and her eyes were briefly and unexpectedly full. She blinked it away before anyone could see, because she was practical and because she had the long drive home ahead of her, and then she folded the receipt carefully and put it in her coat pocket beside the letter to the bank, which she would mail from the Pecos post office on the way out of town. Warren was waiting outside the office when she came out, and he looked at her face and said nothing but held out his hand, and she took it, and they walked together to the post office without letting go. They drove home in 5 days, the Garza brothers driving the empty wagon while Hester and Warren rode, and the Davis Mountains came back into view on the fourth afternoon looking like something she had dreamed and then found was real, those particular familiar slopes of limestone and cedar and sky. And she felt the land know her the way a place knows the person who belongs to it. On the 1st of September, 3 weeks after returning from Pico's, Hester Beckett rode into Marfa and paid the First Territorial Bank of Marfa in full. She paid it in cash, which she had counted and recounted into an envelope the previous evening at the kitchen table, and she sat across from Harland Ives and watched him count it and write her a receipt and stamp it with the bank's seal. And she thanked him and he thanked her, and she walked out of the bank into the bright September morning with the deed to the Beckett ranch fully and completely unencumbered. She stood on the board sidewalk for a moment and looked at the mountains in the distance and thought, simply, I did it. And then she thought, we did it. The wedding was on the 22nd of September, in the autumn warmth of the hill country, on the land itself, which felt to both of them like the right place for it. Dorothea Finch came, having become something like a friend over the summer of correspondence and legal maneuvering. Pedro Garza's wife Elena and their 2 children came from Presidio County, which Hester had not known about the wife and children until Pedro mentioned them as a matter of course, and which she immediately invited without ceremony. Miguel brought a cousin from Alpine who played guitar at a level that made the evening something Hester would later describe as the best music she had ever heard. The ceremony was performed by the minister from Marfa, who was a small, earnest man named Reverend Cole, who did not seem to have any opinions about unconventional women marrying their foremen on their own land, and who read the words with a straightforwardness that matched the occasion. Warren stood beside her under the oak tree her father had planted in the yard when he first arrived on the land, and he looked at her with that full, clear, honest face, and when Reverend Cole asked if he took her, he said I do with the same deliberateness he brought to everything, like a statement of fact that was also a statement of intention, and she felt it in her bones. When he kissed her, it lasted slightly longer than a ceremonial kiss, and she was not sorry about that. Elena Garza had made an extraordinary amount of food, the kind of cooking that expressed love through quantity and quality in equal measure, and they ate in the yard as the evening came in soft and golden over the mountains, and Miguel played guitar until the stars were fully out, and it was, Hester thought, exactly what a wedding ought to be, real and warm and full of people who meant it. That night in the ranch house that was now fully and entirely her own and his, she lay beside Warren in the darkness and listened to the deep country quiet and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that the world was arranged as it should be. Warren, she said quietly in the dark. Yes, he said. He was already awake. She had known he was. Thank you for not saying anything, she said. Those first weeks, when you knew, he was quiet for a moment. You didn't need me to say anything, he said. You needed someone to stand beside you and let you do what you had to do. Yes, she said. That's exactly what I needed. I know, he said. She turned toward him in the dark, and he was already turned toward her, and she thought about how it was a remarkable and specific kind of luck to find a person who understood not just what you needed but why, and who gave it to you not because he was asked, but because he simply was that kind of person. I love you, she said. It was the first time she had said it directly, though she thought they had both been saying it in other ways for months. I love you, he said back, with the same plainness, the same certainty, like a coordinate on a map. Here, exactly here, this is where I am. She fell asleep in his arms listening to the wind in the cedar, and the land outside was silent and whole and hers. The following year was the year the Beckett Ranch expanded. Not dramatically, not all at once, but with the measured confidence of a place that has found its footing and is ready to grow from it. Warren negotiated the lease of an adjacent 40 acres from a neighbor who had taken ill and could not work his land, and they brought in a small additional herd of breeding cattle that changed the long-term profile of the operation from subsistence to genuine productivity. Pedro and Miguel stayed on, both of them having indicated without much formal discussion that they intended to stay on, and they each had a stake in the place now that went beyond the wage, the kind of investment that happens when people feel genuinely valued and treated with the fairness they deserve. Hester wrote a long letter to Dorothea Finch describing the year, and received a letter back that was warm and wry, and mentioned that Finch had herself taken on a junior associate, a young woman from San Antonio who had read law in secret for 3 years before finding a practice willing to take her. Hester wrote back that she was not surprised and that the world was changing, slowly and with considerable resistance, but changing. In the spring of 1884, Hester found out she was carrying a child. She told Warren on a Tuesday evening, which seemed to be their day for significant things, and he sat down very slowly in the kitchen chair, as though his legs had needed a moment to process the information. And then he looked at her with an expression she had not seen before on his face, something raw and luminous and slightly overwhelmed. And she crossed the kitchen and put her arms around him from behind and rested her chin on his shoulder and said, "Are you all right?" "I am extremely all right," he said, with the precision of someone who is feeling something very large and is using words carefully so as not to misrepresent it. She laughed, and he put his hands over hers where they crossed on his chest, and they stayed like that for a while. Their son was born in November of 1884, in the ranch house with the help of a midwife from Marfa named Clara Holt, who arrived 2 days early because she had learned to trust her instincts about such things, and was consequently present and ready when the baby came in the early hours of a cold November morning. He was a solid, pink-faced, thoroughly opinionated child from the first moment, and Warren held him with the careful astonishment of someone who has been handed something more significant than he knows what to do with, and looked at him for a very long time without speaking. They named him Ellis Warren Beckett Abbott, for her father and for him, and Hester said the name aloud in the quiet of the bedroom, where the morning was just beginning to come through the window, and it sounded right. It sounded like something that was supposed to exist, and she held her son and felt the fullness of a life that had come together out of so much uncertainty and loss and sheer stubborn will. Pedro Garza came to see the baby on the second day, hat in hand, and Alina had sent a covered dish of food that smelled magnificent, and Pedro looked at the baby for a moment with the particular softness of a man who has children of his own and said, "He has your eyes, Miss Hester." She was Mrs. Abbott now, Warren said from the doorway, with very mild amusement. She was Miss Beckett first, Pedro said, without missing a beat, which was entirely true and which made Hester laugh so hard the baby startled. The years settled into themselves with the quality of good years, not without difficulty, not without the ordinary sorrows and setbacks of life and land and weather, but shaped by a fundamental solidity that held through the harder times. The drought of 1886 was difficult, as it was for every ranch in the region, but the Beckett operation had built enough reserve in the good years to carry through it without desperate decisions, and Warren's management of the herd through the dry months, rotating the grazing with careful calculation, kept the losses to a manageable level when their neighbors sustained far worse. Ellis grew from an opinionated infant into an opinionated small person who showed, from about the age of 3, a passionate interest in horses that Pedro encouraged with the devotion of a man who recognizes a kindred spirit, and which Hester watched with a mixture of pride and the specific slightly terrified love of a parent watching their child fall hard for something that could also hurt them. He was also, their son, the kind of child who asked questions continuously and at considerable length, and who expected full and honest answers rather than simplifications, which Warren provided with the patient thoroughness of a man who respects curiosity in all its forms. She listened sometimes to the two of them in the barn, Ellis firing questions about horses or cattle or weather or stars, and Warren answering each one carefully and accurately, and felt the particular happiness that lives in a specific kind of quiet moment, the kind you recognize as one of the good ones while you are still inside it. In 1888 they had a daughter, and they named her Clara Beckett Abbott, for the midwife and for the land. And she was a different kind of person from her brother from the start, quieter and more observant, with Warren's creekwater eyes and Hester's capacity for sustained and focused thought. Ellis, at 4, was extremely interested in his sister for approximately 2 days before the horses reclaimed his full attention, which seemed to suit Clara, who appeared to prefer her own company to anyone's except her mother's. Calhoun Driscoll had, by this point, largely ceased to be a presence in their lives. His cattle company had contracted in the years since his attempt to claim the Beckett land, partly due to mismanagement and partly due to the drought, and he had sold off most of the adjacent acreage in 1887 and moved, according to local report, to San Antonio. Hester did not feel satisfaction at his diminishment exactly, but she felt a clean kind of relief at the distance. It was Miguel Garza who, in the spring of 1889, came to her with the news that the parcel to the east, one of the Driscoll Company's former holdings that had changed hands twice since the sale, was now available again, and that the current owner was willing to sell at a fair price. He brought her the information with the casual care of someone who knows something matters without making a production of it, and she thanked him and took it to Warren that evening. They sat at the kitchen table with the lamp lit and the children sleeping, and they worked through the figures, and the figures, as they had been for some time, were good. Not extravagant, not showily profitable, but good, the kind of good that comes from steady work and sound decisions, and the particular loyalty of people who feel that the place they work is worth their care. They bought the eastern parcel in May of 1889, and the Beckett Ranch was now 600 acres, and it was fully, completely, incontrovertibly Hester's. She stood on the new fence line on the first morning after the papers were signed, in the early light with the mountains doing what they always did in the early light, which was look as though they were being invented fresh, and she felt the land extend itself in her chest to include the new acreage, felt it slot into place the way a piece of knowledge slots into place when you have been reaching for it. Warren came to stand beside her because he always knew where she was, and they stood together on the fence line in the morning light and looked at the country that was theirs. "Your father would have been proud," he said. "Yes," she said. "He would have been proud of you too." He was quiet for a moment. "He built something that lasted," he said. "So did we," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, and they stood like that for a while in the morning that was getting brighter by the minute, and the cattle were moving somewhere out of sight in the new pasture, and a red-tailed hawk turned slow circles above the cedar breaks, and somewhere behind them the ranch house had begun to make the sounds of a house waking up. Ellis's voice asking something and Clara's quieter response, and the ordinary music of a morning that was exactly like every other morning, and completely unlike any other morning at all. Hester thought about the night she had cut her hair in the barn, with the scissors that still hung on their hook where she had replaced them. She thought about the woman she had made of her father's clothes and her own bone-deep stubbornness. She thought about the first morning Warren Abbott had stepped off the Marfa stage and looked at her across the street with those clear autumn-colored eyes that had, she understood now, seen her almost immediately. She thought about what it meant to make yourself into something in order to survive, and then, having survived, to find that you could be yourself again fully with all the parts of yourself present and accounted for, and that the person standing beside you had known all along which one was real and had chosen that one, the real one, deliberately and completely. "Warren," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'm glad you came," she said. "To the ranch. I'm glad you answered the advertisement." He looked at her with that expression she loved, the open and unguarded one that was reserved for the moments when he was not trying to manage anything, and was simply present in all his considerable depth. "I came for a job," he said. "I stayed for you." "I know," she said. "That's one of my favorite things about the whole story." He pressed a kiss to her temple, warm and unhurried, and she closed her eyes for a moment and felt the sun on her face and the solid warmth of him beside her and the land solid and real beneath her feet, the land that had been worth every inch of the fight to keep it. Ellis came running from the direction of the barn with the complete physical commitment of a small child who has somewhere urgent to be, and he threw himself into the narrow space between his parents with the confidence of a child who has never experienced anything but a warm welcome there. And Warren caught him with one arm and Hester caught him with the other, and he squirmed and demanded to know if they could ride to the new pasture today. Could they? Papa said there were new fence posts to check. Could he help? He was 7 now, he was old enough. You are absolutely old enough, Hester said, and Warren said he would get the horses, and Ellis made the triumphant sound of a child who has won something important. Clara appeared at the gate of the yard, smaller and quieter, watching with her serious eyes. Hester detached herself from the group and went to her daughter and picked her up, and Clara settled against her shoulder with the contained satisfaction that was her characteristic mode, and Hester carried her toward the barn where Warren was already leading out the horses, and Ellis was already talking at a speed that suggested he had been holding thoughts in reserve overnight. The morning opened out in front of them, clear and gold and full of the specific ordinary work that was also everything. That was the whole of the life they had built, day by day, out of stubbornness and honesty, and the specific kind of love that chooses someone completely and keeps choosing them, in the barn and at the table and in the hard years and the good ones, on the fence line in the early light, and in the quiet dark of a house full of sleeping children. The Beckett Ranch stood on its limestone foundation against the Davis Mountains in the particular West Texas light that turns the country into something between a painting and a dream. And it was hers, and it was theirs, and it was exactly where every road she had ever taken had been leading, including the strange and necessary road of the scissors and the ash-darkened lip, and the borrowed name she had used until she did not need it anymore. The land held them, and they held the land, and the morning was beginning in earnest, and there was work to do.